Good day, everyone. My name is Matt Icefire Shooty. I run the Virtual United States Atlantic Command, and I'd like to welcome you all to Tales from the Wrenches, an interview podcast series with the membership at the Virtual United States Atlantic Command. We hope you enjoy this first installment. There will be more to come. Our first victim for the interview will be Spiceman from VF41. He's rather famous in the DCS community, is making some of the best instructional and informational videos out there.
Oh, hey. Yeah, I'm famous because I'm the guy that doesn't mind doing the videos, so I guess I'm it. So yeah, that's my thing. I like doing the videos. I like kind of teaching. I'm kind of an instructor at heart. One of the first jobs I had in the civilian world was a technical instructor. So yeah, I like kind of doing that stuff, and so it kind of puts me out front and center, I guess. I'll take it.
So our first question is, what did you do in the Navy?
I was an AT, aviation electronics technician or avionics technician. Back then, the Navy had two rates that kind of work together. In the Navy, you have a rate and you have a rating. The rate is your job, like your AT or A2 or AQ, and then the I'm sorry, that's the rating. The rate is your like your pay grade, E4, E5, E6, whatever. So back then, I think the Navy only has what they call an AT now. Back then, they had AT and AQ back in the 80s and 90s. An AT was an avionics technician, and AQ was an aviation fire control radar technician. But on the F-14, I think on some airframes, they were actually separate shops. But in the F-14, they all worked together in one shop called IWT, the Integrated Weapons Team. And so that's what I did. Now we went to different schools, but we all did the same job. It's not like if you work right next to somebody, you're like, I'm not doing that, you're doing that. So we all did the same thing. So what we worked on the Tomcat was really everything that wasn't flight controls or flight instruments. So we worked on anything electronic, and just thinking of the Tomcat and DCS in the front seat, um, the TACAN. I'm just thinking through the cockpit from a left around to the right. We did the TACAN, the ICS, the UHF, VHF, the radar altimeter, VDI HUD, HSD, everything controlled by your PDCP there on the right. That was all of us, or the ILS, the beacon, the AUG9, the INS, the ALE 39, the LR 4550, all the raw gear, pretty much everything. If it wasn't flight controls or your basic flight instruments, it was maintained by us.
That sounds like some pretty advanced stuff for straight out of high school. How did you end up being an AT anyway?
Well, I was always interested in electronics. In school, I took electronics. I was kind of one of the kids that put, the Heath kits together, back in the day, that sort of stuff. So I was always, interested in that. I was looking to go in the service. I always knew I was going to go in the service. It was just something that was always in my head. I was in Civil Air Patrol, um, the all that sort of stuff. So it was just something I had pre-decided I was going to do, and I was actually going to go in the Air Force. I went to visit the Air Force recruiter, but and I purely wound up in the Navy because the Navy recruiter was better. The Air Force recruiter was kind of like uninterested. Really didn't engage at all. Just kind of checking the clock, really. But the Navy recruiter was like, "Hey, come on in here." He was a real salesman, that guy was. And so I went into the Navy because the Navy was a better recruiter. That's pretty much the way it happened.
Wow, that's
Um,
that's pretty amazing. I would have never thought, the Air Force guy just being kind of blasé about it, huh?
Yep, very blasé. And that was so I was actually 17 when I joined. My birthday is in May, and it was in the October of my senior year in high school, so I was still 17 that I joined and went to what's called the delayed entry program. You sign the paperwork and all that, um, uh, and then you go in after you sort of graduate high school. So yeah, I actually joined in October of '83, and I entered boot camp in August of '84 after I graduated.
Moving forward a little bit, what did you once you got into the Navy and got past boot camp? I'm guessing you went to some kind of advanced school for being an AT, right? Did they tell you you was going to be an AT, or did you choose it?
No, you chose it. There are guys that don't choose a job when they go in. That's a big mistake. So just a little piece of advice for young guys out there. There's certainly nothing wrong with the service, but if you're going to go in with a plan, right? So yeah, I kind of went in with a plan. The guys that where the recruiter talks them into, you don't have to pick a job now. Go in first, and you can pick a job later if you don't know what you want to do. Those are the guys that really wind up scrubbing toilets, right? So, yeah, the advice there is to go in with a plan. So I signed up to go in as an AT, and I did well enough on the entrance exams that they offered me advanced training. So, which was you join for 6 years and you go to advanced school. So that's what I did. So I went to it was in Memphis. So after boot camp. Went to boot camp in Great Lakes, got out of that, and then went to Memphis, Tennessee, which is where that school was at the time. Millington was the name of the town it was in. That's all closed down now. I think they moved it all to Jacksonville. But yeah, so I went there, and there's several schools you go through. You start off with EBAT or Enlisted Basic Aviation Training. That's the first school you go to. That's a few weeks of just learning what an airplane is and stuff like that. And then after that, the next school was called BEE or Basic Electricity and Electronics, and that was a self-paced school. You could get through it in as soon as a few months or as much as a year. I got through it pretty quickly. Um, and then after BEE, if you don't sign up, if you didn't do the sign up for the advanced training, well then you're done and you head off to the fleet. But I stayed in Memphis for an additional 6 months for a school. It was called AFTA, Advanced First Term Avionics, and that was, I think, a 9 month school of advanced avionics, and it was pretty grueling. I mean, we tracked an electron from one end of the radar system to the other, right? Every transistor talked about transistor theory and all. It was pretty grueling school. It was like 9 months worth. And the bonus for AFTA is that you sign up for 6 years, but you go to this advanced school and you get E4 right out of school, which is really nice because you get to bypass a lot of the stuff in the Navy you have to go through if you're E3 and below. I never had to wash dishes or scrub floors or work in the mess hall or stuff like that. So, but yeah, so that was my path. Yep.
Wow. Okay. Um, so how did you find any of that really difficult, or were you just kind of a natural at it?
Um, I was kind of a natural at it. I was kind of a fan of that sort of stuff. I've been kind of a simmer my whole life into the electronics end of stuff. So yeah, that was my sort of vocation. So I took to it pretty quickly. So yeah, it wasn't too bad for me.
Okay.
Yep.
Um, so fast forwarding a little more, what ships did you serve on, and really did you have a favorite?
Let's see. Well, I got out of school. I left Memphis in it was end of the summer, 1985. I think it was like August or September. I think I got 30 days vacation and then checked into my first command at Oceana. I got F-14s. I was assigned F-14s, went to Oceana. And then at Oceana, you go through another school. You go through F-14 specific training. It's a program called FRAMP, Fleet Replacement Aviation Maintenance Personnel. It's a part of VF 101. the F-14 RAG there at Oceana. Well, they also do F-14 specific electronics training, for the maintainers. And so I went through that. That was a few months. And then in January of 86, the day the Challenger blew up, I checked into VF-41 at Oceana there, and they were on the Nimitz. And I have to say the Nimitz is probably my favorite only because it was the first one. It's kind of where I cut my chops. Um, they had great cinnamon buns. Every ship is known for something they do really well, food-wise, and the Nimitz had great cinnamon buns. But anyway, so yeah, checked into via 41 on the Nimitz, and then we did that was in January of '86, and then in January of '87, after a series of workups throughout the year, we went on a 6-month deployment to the Med on the Nimitz. So yeah, I gotta say the Nimitz was my favorite. Yep.
Awesome.
In addition, we that was the Nimitz's last East Coast cruise. It's a West Coast ship now. Well, that was its last East Coast deployment. And on the way home, we didn't come back to Norfolk. We actually went down around South America and dropped the ship off and left the ship in San Diego. And so got the shell back and all that on the way. Yeah. So all that experience, it makes the Nimitz my favorite. Sure.
Okay, so you mentioned the shellback. I'm pretty sure anybody who's a fan of naval aviation or Navy in general knows that the whole polywog versus shellback thing. Can you explain what happened to you, or what was the process in the 80s when you went through it? Because apparently it's a whole lot different now.
Oh, I'm sure it's all a lot different now. There were two things you got. Most people don't know. The other one is called the Blue Nose. You get that when you cross the Arctic Circle, and I got both on the Nimitz. During the workups on the Nimitz in '86, in the fall of '86, we went on this thing called Operation Northern Wedding. It was a big NATO exercise, but we went up to Norway. We actually went into the fjords of Norway on the boat, which is really cool. But we went above the Arctic Circle, and that's to get your Blue Nose. And to get your Blue Nose, you strip down to your skivvies and you run across the flight deck. And it's freezing cold, and you do it in the freezing cold, and then you get your Blue Nose. That's all pretty simple.
Wow.
But yeah, the big one is the shellback. So crossing the equator. Yeah, and it's interesting when you cross the equator. I'm kind of a science-minded guy. I did a science experiment on the way. On the ship's TV, they have multiple channels. One of the channels is the SINS channel, the ship's inertial navigation system, and it just broadcasts your position. Like on if you've ever been on an airliner, and it kind of shows your position. Well, this is the SINS, and it kind of shows the ship's position on the TV all the time. So we actually crossed the equator overnight. Also, night check. It was in the wee hours in the morning. We actually crossed the equator, and so I did a little experiment. The water swirling down the drain thing, and I actually wanted to try that, and so I did that. And as you cross the equator, the little whirlpool gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And when you're on top of the equator, you don't actually get a whirlpool. The water just kind of evenly goes down the drain, and then as you pass the equator, the little whirlpool starts forming again, spinning in the opposite direction. So that was really cool. But I digress. But yeah, the whole shellback thing is a whole process, and begins like the day before, actually the week before. They had this thing called the WOG Beauty Contest, right? If you haven't crossed the equator before, you're a WOG or a polywog. If you have crossed the equator before, you're a shellback. And so, like the week before, they do this whole polywog beauty contest. Every squadron, every ship's division has some guy that like dresses in drag, and they do this whole big party in the hangar deck. Everybody just kind of hooting and hollering it up. They serve, food. They bring out the tables of burgers and stuff, and they have this whole production of this polywog beauty contest of these guys in drag strutting across the hangar deck, and everybody hooting and hollering and playing music. And yeah, so that's like the week before, and they pick a winner. They pick the Polywog Beauty Contest winner, and they get a title. I can't remember what it's called. Maybe it's like King Neptune's wife, and they give him a title or whatever. But so that happens, and then like the day before, the night before, it's like Hell Night for the Polywogs, and they get to do they get to wreak havoc on the shellbacks. We tarred and feathered a guy. So we in the middle of the night, we dragged one of our shellback chiefs out of his rack in the middle of the night, and we sprayed shaving cream all over him. We slid open a pillow and we feathered the guy. And so the night before is kind of mischief night for the polywogs. So we did we did stuff like that. Um, and then in the morning, the shit hits the fan, right? So in the morning, they yank you out of, they come through the berthing, banging trash cans or whatever, get out of bed, you measly pollywogs, whatever. They make these things called shillelaghs. They cut up a fire hose into like 4 foot lengths, and they can beat you with these shillelaghs. So they drag you out of bed and they beat you with these shillelaghs. There's a rule; they're not allowed to like swing it more than 4 feet or something like that. But that's their tool for the day is shillelaghs, and you're not allowed to be off your hands and knees the entire day. For the entire day, you are on your hands and knees, and they drag you through this whole process. They yank you out of bed. You go to wog breakfast. They go through the mess hall. They make you eat a bunch of crap. They store up trash for like days and weeks before, and they feed you these rotten eggs and whatever kind of garbage, and then they make you eat it. They're beating you with these shillelaghs. You're crawling around on your hands and knees, and so you get wog breakfast, and then they shuffle you all out onto the hangar deck, and they drop the elevators, and you crawl onto the elevator. They're squirting fire hoses on you from the flight deck all the while you're doing this. And you go up on the elevator to the flight deck, and they got the whole thing set up right. Some of you have heard about. You're crawling your hands and knees across the flight deck. They have these stations set up. They'll make you stop along the way and do crazy stuff like blow oily water out of the pad eyes into each other's faces, and you go to the first station, and it's like what's this, King Neptune or whatever the guy is. It's the biggest, fattest, hairiest shellback that they got on the boat, and you have to crawl up to him on your hands and knees, and he has grease on his belly, and you rubs your face in it and all that sort of stuff. And then next to him is the Wog Queen from the Pollywog Beauty Contest, and you gotta kiss the guy's feet and stuff like that. And it's just a massive, well organized hazing incident, and it all wraps up with you. They got a bunch of engine cans. They ship the engines around in these big cans, and they fill it up with garbage and water, and you have to jump in there and crawl through it. And they insist that you actually go completely under the water, and so you're in this garbage filled water. A lot of guys have barfed in it in front of you. And so it's just really nasty. And then you finally crawl out of that engine can, and the guy says, "What are you?" And you go, and you're so used to saying, I'm just a polywog, that a lot of guys say, "I'm a polywog." And he's like, "You jackass, go through it again," and then make you crawl through the thing again. Because what you're supposed to say is, "I'm a shellback, god damn it," or something like that. And the guy goes, "You're goddamn right you are," and then you're done. And uh you um they have a bunch of fire hoses hanging from the crane and stuff like that, kind of like showers. They don't want you going below decks like that. So you kind of shower off, you take your clothes off right then and there, and you throw them overboard. Uh so you're basically naked with nothing but your boots on, and you go down, you take a shower, and you're done. So, yeah, that's the whole process. It actually goes in your service record. You have an entry in your service record. But yeah, if you were like an objector, right? These guys that, let's say you're super religious, and we actually had a guy in my shop where he was super religious, and he's like a conscientious objector or whatever, and kind of refused to do it. You could do that. But what they did with those guys is they had to get dressed up in their dress blues, and they had to go spend the day in the forecastle, which is the fore part of the. It's like a ceremonial part of the ship. It's in the very front, where the anchor chains are and all that. And you basically have to stay in your dress blues in the forecastle all day if you're a conscientious objector. So
So,
yeah.
so here's my question to you. Do you think that we all hear, we've got some newer naval guys in the air wing that didn't have to go through it quite like you did. Now, do you think that maybe we've lost something by not doing that anymore, or do you think that thank good riddance, it's gone?
Yeah. I'm not one of those old school guys. I was like, oh, these kids, these that's not my style. I'm sure that they build camaraderie in 100 different ways than we did. That was just the way that we did it, right? It was a tradition. Traditions are bound to change. Records are bound to be broken. Whatever. So I'm sure they do something now. I'm sure it's not like that, like what we did, but I'm sure they do something. I have no idea how it's changed, but yeah, no, I'm not one of those kinds of guys. I'm sure that they still have their traditions now. They're just different, and yeah.
We're changing subjects a little bit back to kind of what your main job was. I had a question here.
Mhm.
What was the thing on the Tomcat that broke the most that you hated fixing? Like it was the constant complaint.
Yeah. We had a couple things that always broke. We had a couple antennas on the airplane that we gave nicknames to. There was one, the ACLS antenna. Um, in fact, I kind of teased Heapler about it a little bit because they don't show it on the Heapler Tomcat. If you look on the Heapler Tomcat, on the chin, under the nose there in the front where the TCS is, well, hanging down from that is a blade antenna. That's the ACLS antenna. But you'll notice it's not on Heapler's Tomcat, and I'm sure the reason is because they scanned a museum model or whatnot, and I'm sure it was snapped off because they always did it. We called it the backstabber, right? So as guys duck underneath that the nose of the plane there, they always knock that. They get that antenna, and it leaves a giant scar in your back. I wouldn't be surprised if I still have one. But it jabs you in the back, and if you hit it hard enough, not only does it make you bleed, but it snaps the antenna off, and it was a pain in the ass to change because you had to open the TCS pod up, which is sealed with RTV, all right, and it's a real pain. So you have to um, scrape that RTV off, take all the screws out, open it up, change that antenna, which is safety wired on, and all this crap because it's forward of the nose. Um, and so that was and then you had to TCS pod, you had to reseal it with the RTV. It was a real pain. So that was a common thing that broke, and then the other one was on top. Um, the ALR 45 antenna on the top of the plane, just behind the canopy, was another one. We called that one the football antenna because guys would step over the hump in the back up there called the turtle back, and they would kick that antenna off, and it would go flying, and then we'd have to change that, and that was a pain to open because there's another panel with 100 different screws in it. The flight controls run through that panel, so before you close it up, you got to get QA out there to inspect it and all that. So that was another pain in the butt thing that broke all the time that we had to change. But as far as like avionics goes, the biggest pain in the butt was the VDI because it was just really hard to change. There was 50 things you had to undo to change that thing. If you're on the boat, you got like 15 minutes in between recovery and the next launch to change it. You had to pull the ACM panel out. Behind the ACM panel, there's a bracket back there that you got to get off. And then you're supposed to get the AEs to come up and disconnect the stick and lay the stick over, but we never had time to do that. So we just muscled the stick out of the way, pulled the VDI out. It's like 4 feet long. You got to reach way down in back of it and undo these cannon plugs that you can't actually see. You just got to feel. And so that was probably the nemesis of the flight deck troubleshooters world is having a bad VDI, having a plane come back with a bad VDI and have to change that for the next launch. But yeah, every launch something is. That's why they talk about the amount of maintenance hours the Tomcat took. An airplane coming back without something to have to be changed was the exception. You almost always had to change something on the F-14 when it came back, from something minor like just some bit sequence failure on the OG9, or to something like a VDI or whatever, it was very rare that you didn't have anything to do on the F-14, but on a recovery. So,
I have one more question, and this is just one that popped in my head. Did you spend more time on the flight deck or in the hangar?
well, a shop has what they call the flight deck troubleshooters. And there's two guys per shift on the shop that work the flight deck. Um, and that's what I did most of the time. I was, I'm not bragging, but just I was pretty good at what I did, and so I was one of the two guys that was a flight deck troubleshooter. Was that we work in a pair on the flight deck, and we're just the guys that supported, the launches and all that. And The air crew came back. We would meet them, get a quick debrief, decide what needed changing, and change it. And that's why they kind of picked the two best maintenance guys in the shop to do that, because you're the guys that have to decide. You got 30 seconds to decide what box needs to be changed based on a aircrew debrief, and then you called down to the shop. They had runners that would run the part up, and while they were running it up, you would get busy pulling the old one out. But that's what I did. No, that was my job in the shop. So I spent most of my time on the flight deck. Now they did stick me down in the hangar again, not bragging, but we had an airplane. It's one of my sea stories. We had an airplane that would come back broke every single time. It was fine on the deck. Something in the air broke this airplane, and what broke was the CI. If you're familiar with the back seat on your left, there, your jettison switches, your station select switches, all that. Well, that thing would come back broke after every single flight. And nobody could figure out why, because it only broke in the air, right? So how do you troubleshoot something like that? So this airplane became the hangar queen. It was 103. I'll never forget it. Um, and I actually got a letter of commendation for fixing this. So I spent like a week in the hangar on this airplane trying to figure out what was wrong with this airplane. Eventually, kind of figured it out. But I was like, well, what are they doing in the air that's different than on the ground? Well, the transmitter fires, right? I mean, you can turn the transmitter on the ground, but there's a dummy load that's switched in with weight on wheels. Well, so if there's weight off wheels, the transmitter's firing. Let me pull on that thread and see what's going on. And so finally, after several days, managed to duplicate it. And duplicating the problem is like half of the half of the way to fixing it, right? If you can duplicate it, you're golden, right? So I finally duplicated it. Every time I I, I tricked the weight off wheels, and turned the transmitter on, and sure enough, the CI fried, and it didn't actually fry. You just run OBC, and you can tell from the failures that the CI is bad. And so finally, okay, well, we finally know when specifically the CI is frying, and so we just read every single wire coming off of that transmitter to where it's supposed to go, and sure enough, they had changed the cannon plug on the transmitter several weeks before, because it went bad, and they had two pins switched in that cannon plug. And so some voltage that was come that the some sensing pin or whatever that um, the transmitter was putting a voltage on a pin. Well, because they had them swapped, it was going to the wrong place, and it was putting a voltage on the CI where it shouldn't have been, and it was frying the CI when they turned the transmitter on. And so, yeah, that's my hangar C story in troubleshooting one of our hangar queens. We were under a lot of pressure. They do not like hangar queens on the boat. And so they pulled me off the flight deck and said, "Your job is to get down in the hangar and fix that freaking airplane, because we're getting our ass chewed every day because of that airplane." So yeah, that's my sea story there.
I can tell you that I really enjoy working on cars. I consider myself a mechanical person now. Recently, I'm getting into motorcycles, but let me tell you that I can I envy you, and you have more patience than I will ever have with that, because anytime there's an electrical problem on a vehicle, I fold up. I refuse, because it's like
Yeah.
just like you said you were doing. You're tracing every single wire, and it could. just be something wrong, like you said, a pin wrong or a wire frayed. It's just it's a nightmare.
Yeah, troubleshooting wiring on an airplane sucks because it's not like you can pull out a multimeter and reach both ends of it, right? And so it's a two-person job. And what you do is, because an airplane is basically one giant piece of metal, you take the pin on one end of the cable and you ground it to a piece of metal, on the panel or whatever, and then the guy at the other end of the wire is reading between the pin and the airplane, and you should be able to read continuity that way with one guy grounding one end and one guy reading in the other end. But yeah, troubleshooting wiring is a pain in the ass. And a lot of it, especially in an airplane, is in places that are hellish places on an airplane, right? So, yeah, it is a exercise in, stress positions in working on an airplane, that's for sure. Yeah.
That's crazy. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think we've reached what I wanted to reach. So great. We're 30 minutes for that. So, hey, I'd like to turn it over to you now. I'm out of questions pretty much. So, what if you have any sea stories you feel like sharing with us? That'd be great.
Yeah, I could just tell you about actually some adventures on the flight deck. It's actually one of them is, my very first time on the flight deck. It was in, I think, April of 1986. Um, and it was just a CQ. The boat was out off of Norfolk for whatever, and they decided to get some guys CQ'd, and so they flew a group of us out there. It was like my first time on the boat. It was like, hey, let's send Spicer out there with some other guys because it's good experience, right? Low pressure. The planes weren't even supposed to stay there. They were just going to bounce on the boat, get their traps in, and then land back at Oceana. And so they just put a group of us, a chief and like 10 of us, um, on a cod and flew us out there. We trapped on the boat, which was fun. And Yeah, so we were just a small detachment out there, just in case anything went wrong while these guys were CQing. Well, this one of our airplanes came in, and I was on the flight deck. It was at night, probably been the first time on the flight deck at night. I had one of the veterans out there with me. I was hanging on to him, learning the ropes, and sure enough, the airplane landed and the wire broke. So that was my very first time on the flight deck. The wire broke actually below deck, in the machinery room. So it was nothing that really went flying around the deck or anything. But you could tell something was wrong because the airplane wasn't really stopping like it should. We were back right off of L3, right by the foul line, right by the landing area. And the airplane initially slowed down, but then it just kind of kept taxiing forward on the landing area. There was a bunch of sparks because, the wire sagged. And so the airplane was dragging the wire. The hook was still, engaged with the wire, was dragging the wire. Sparks were flying. And I was like, that ain't right. And next thing I know, ejected. The little explosion you see, the canopy went flying, and then poof, poof, the two aircrew went out. I was like, holy shit. Um, so the pilot, when they eject, the pilot goes up and to the left, and so he went off of the landing area into the water, and the helo went to pick him up. Well, the Rio, he came down right in the landing area, um, and so he kind of came down like right in front of us. And so a bunch of guys went out there and kind of stomped on the parachute to kind of keep him from being blown aft and off the flight deck. And so yeah, and so this guy, I remember their names. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Sadler. His call sign was Tree, and the Rio's name was Collins. Hal Collins. I can't remember what his call sign was. It might have been Hal, but anyway. So I remember that crew, and then so lo and behold, one of the guys in our organization, Mouse, flies for VFA 97. He knows um, Sadler, who actually went on. He did his time at in the Navy full time, and then stayed in the reserve, still flew, Wind up flying the F-14 in the reserves. Went to Dallas and actually commanded, the reserve squadron at Dallas, and actually worked his way up to be a rear admiral. Well, since our guy Mouse knows him, he just happened to mention that one day, and I was like, "Oh, that's Sadler. I know him. Let me tell you the sea story." I told him that sea story. Well, he related to Rear Admiral retired now Sadler because he knew him from like their golf course or something like that. And so, and we can actually flash a picture up here in our podcast if you want. He sent me this handwritten letter of, "Hey, Spicer, I remember you," and this really nice handwritten letter on his stationery and a challenge coin, with his name on it and whatnot. So yeah, that was really cool. To get this letter from Rear Admiral Sadler, and I watched his ejection, 30 years ago, on my first time on the flight deck on the Nimitz. So yeah, that was really cool. I'm gonna write him back. And so yeah, I got a pen pal now of Rear Admiral Sadler, who I watched eject on the flight deck of the Nimitz in 1986.
That's
So
incredible. It's a
that's
small
it.
world considering we've got a
That's a
guy
cool
that
story.
we've got a guy here that knows the guy that you saw eject. Yeah, that's incredible. Small world.
Isn't that something? Yeah, yeah. There were a couple things that cruise. It was a pretty eventful cruise. Later on during that deployment, in '87, the Whale, we had back then on the boat, we had one airplane called, it was a Whale. We called it the Whale. It was the EA-3B. It was a electronic warfare airplane. Each boat had one of them. Well, that thing crashed on that deployment as well. They tried to catch the wire a bunch of times, got into a fuel emergency. So we rigged the barricade and they tried to catch the barricade, and they just clipped the top of it and crashed. So yeah, that happened that first deployment. There was another one with an S3. I think that was on the Nimitz in '87. It might have been the Roosevelt in '89, but yeah, it caught the wire, but the nose gear collapsed, and the pilot thought that and then I think the hook disengaged the wire. The pilot and they went flying off the angle deck there really slow by this time though, and the pilot didn't think they were going to make it, so he called for them to eject. So they the guy pulled the handle, but the only one of the four ejected, the NFO in the right seat. He ejected. The other four didn't. They found out later on, I heard, that the command eject lever was installed wrong. So the one guy ejected. He landed on one of our airplanes up on the 40 on the bow, but the guy wound up recovering. He recovered the S3. They called to rig the barricade, and we rigged the barricade. And he came and caught the barricade with the giant gaping hole in the side of the airplane where the NFO punched out. So yeah, that was another one on that deployment. So yeah, that was pretty eventful.
Wow,
Yep.
that's incredible. I mean, you always hear that it's the most dangerous 4 acres in the world, and
Yep, yep. We had an A7 that just never came back on that cruise. So there was nothing to see. But we had an A7 that just never came back from his hop, and I don't know that they ever found out what happened to it, but he had we had an A7 just flat out disappear. So yeah, that was quite a few things on that deployment.
that's wild. I mean, I couldn't imagine. I mean, I've never been there, and it was one of my but I have a lot of friends like you guys that were, so it's really interesting to hear these stories.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not just on the flight deck. There was a guy that died from steam burns on that deployment.
Wow.
So yeah, yeah, it's a dangerous job.
I really appreciate you coming today and sharing these stories with us. It's been really interesting. So we're definitely going to do some more of these. We've got, I think, at least 3 more guys that have actually been on the flight deck. So we're going to continue these over the next month or so. So yeah, great. Thank
Oh
you,
yeah,
Spice.
yeah, you work on the flight deck for a while. I got a million of them, right? So we could do 10 of these podcasts, and I'd never run out of stories.
We're definitely going to have you back then. That's for sure. You just volunteered yourself.